Hi, this is Joe Moriarty. Welcome to another special edition here of the Training-Led Growth Podcast. I'm the CEO of Raven 360. Thanks for coming and listening and watching. I have an amazing guest for us today. I'm super excited. Joined by me today is Colonel Christopher Conley, U.S. Army. Chris, thank you so much for joining in today.
Oh, Joe, thanks for having me.
Really, really appreciate your time. I know that you're a super, super busy guy, and I know your time and for the country is valuable. So thank you, by the way, for all the service, and thanks for everything you're doing in the U.S. right now.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks for the support.
So I want to give just a quick introduction here to Colonel Conley. Pretty amazing background. So first of all, graduate, West Point, was a varsity lacrosse player while at West Point. Also then after graduated from Ranger School, U.S. Army Ranger School, served in the infantry as an infantry officer, 2 years in a Ranger battalion, 4 deployments, 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. After that, ran the Bradley Fighting Vehicle Program in Detroit. Pretty amazing. Then MBA, George Washington University, and also most recently, a graduate of the Eisenhower School for National Resource Strategy, and currently working in the Pentagon. So Chris, did I miss anything on that introduction?
No, you got it right. You hit the highlights. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No, that's an incredible background, and I want to get into kind of the different phases of your career. As you know, we call this the Training-Led Growth Podcast, and we highlight kind of the importance of training, typically in corporate America, or typically even with technology. The importance of ongoing training, ongoing learning, so people grow, and they grow personally, they grow professionally, but then also they learn how to use new technologies, all of those things. And I was really excited to have you on to speak with us today, because I feel like the military is an amazing representation of kind of that concept, this training and educating and ongoing. So I'm really curious, with your background, can you just share with everybody here, what do you, number one, kind of the overall importance of training, but two, kind of the Army's philosophy on it, and how you guys deploy it. I'd love to just hear kind of an open-ended start there, if you could.
Yeah, sure. So the first sort of most important aspect of training in the Army is there's a sort of a buzzword that is you train as you fight. And so, over the last 20 years, we've spent a lot of time fighting, as you know, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and preparing for that is really, really important when the stakes are as high as they are, as you know. The Army's main philosophy of training is really broken down into really two subcategories of training. And so there's individual training, or, making sure that soldiers have the skills they need to do their individual jobs, whether that's, kicking doors in, or, maintaining vehicles, or anything like that. And then there's another aspect of training, which is called collective training. And that's where folks come together in teams, squads, platoons, or larger organizations in the military to come together to accomplish a larger mission. And you have to have both of those components for units to be effective on the battlefield. And that's generally how the Army looks at training, is by doing that. A few other things that I did want to mention, though, and critical to this whole construct is leader development, right? And so you have to have leaders at all levels in the Army really have to take training as the most important aspect of their jobs in the military, and being prepared to go off and do our nation's bidding, so to speak. And so training really becomes the cornerstone of leader development and leadership. And you can't have effective units without effective leaders. So we'll unpack that a little bit more later, but I do want to make sure that you understand how important leadership and leader development is to the overall training management construct. Because without that, really you're just sort of going through the motions and doing sort of rote repetitive tasks. And when you can bring in effective leadership and leader development to the process, that really sort of takes everything up to the next level.
That's amazing. That's really interesting. I caught a couple things there I wanted to touch on. And then as you said, I want to drill down a little deeper into the leader development. I think that's going to be very interesting for many of us in the corporate world who are in leadership positions to learn from you, learn a little bit of knowledge. So we'll jump back to that. The first kind of philosophy that you said, I think is very interesting though, individual training and collective training. I think in our world, in high tech and any corporate kind of B2B, B2C roles, many times I think we focus a lot on the individual training. People are developing new skills for themselves. Maybe it's a sales skill, maybe it's a marketing technique, or it's an engineering task or an engineering technology. And I feel like that's a lot of individual training, which is super important, as you said. But the collective training, I feel like we do a little less of. And I think perhaps that's an area where maybe we could do a better job at in terms of just team execution. Could you just talk a little bit about what does collective training mean a little bit more in that context?
Sure, absolutely. So take a sort of I won't call it a basic mission, but a mission that normally happens in the military, and that is, say you're going to go do a cordon and search operation where you're going to go to someone's house where you suspect there's some bad guys there, and you're going to bring together an organization to actually execute that mission. You've got to have the individual skills at each level for each soldier on that operation to be able to operate their weapon, to be able to move quickly, to be able to, if necessary, do administer first aid or anything like that. Those are all those skills are critical at an individual level, but collectively bringing all those folks together, all those soldiers together to execute a mission is a completely different set of training. And so what you need to do to be able to do that mission is to really instantiate a level of teamwork and interoperability while going through and doing these missions, in a peacetime environment, so that the first time you come together as a platoon or as a company to go conduct an operation, you've gone over this in the past. And what that does is it enables really two things. Number one, it enables familiarity with the mission, so that folks understand where they need to be, when, and more importantly, why. But the other aspect of that that's equally important, if not more so, is that you have the ability to react to unfamiliar situations that pop up throughout the course of executing the mission. And that really is formed in the bedrock of the training environment, is to be able to pull off missions where organizations, multiple soldiers are working together to execute a large-scale mission and be able to react to things that pop up and do so in an effective manner.
That reminded me what you said of a really a quote that I've read a number of times that said, everyone's got a plan until the first bullets fly, or something along that line.
Right. I've heard Mike Tyson attributed to everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth.
Yeah.
Same type of thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm literally leaning forward listening to you talk, because what you're saying, again, this kind of highlights to me an area that we can do a much better job at which is, we train these individual skills, but rarely, I think, as a teams in corporate environments, do we say, let's plan and train to be a unit in unfamiliar situations. Like that was like a real nugget to me, because I feel like, in corporate America, we kind of just talk about and again, let's get into leadership, because I think leadership plays a key role in that. But I don't think situationally we train for unknowns as best we could, or how to act, communicate, and execute in situations kind of as they evolve. And I think that's something that we could really take from your experiences, what you just said. I don't think we do a lot of that situational planning or training that you could use. So that's really interesting. I like that a lot.
Right. So I think, to give you another level or next level down, so to speak, on, how you can do collective training and leader development simultaneously. Unfortunately on the battlefield, casualties happen, right? And nobody wants that. And everybody takes as much precaution as possible to prevent that from happening. But every now and then it does. And so in the course of training, when you have organizations coming together, one of the things that you can do throughout that training process is to simulate leaders that have become a casualty. And what that forces is it forces junior leaders to step into the next level up role and fulfill those duties. And when you do that in training, that does two things. Number one, it prepares the organization to react when things like casualties happen. But the other thing that it does is it develops your junior leaders to rise to the next level of leadership and start to really kind of understand how they need to perform and how their boss is currently performing their job and what they would need to do to be able to step in and fulfill that role. And that's a really critical aspect of collective training, is to be able to bring in junior level leaders and force them to rise to the occasion when, there's, when things happen that you prefer not to happen.
That is really interesting too, because I feel like in many times we don't do enough of that. Maybe at larger organizations they do. Again, we're still a pretty aggressive and small performing team, at Raven 360, but we work with very, very large, what we would call enterprise companies and customers. And maybe they do more of that. But I think in corporate America, there's also like a human nature component, and where, I think people may feel threatened if they're like, all right, what happens if I go away? Are you guys going to be able to carry on? Because I think people want to feel secure in their job, and they want to feel secure in their leadership ability and all of those things. Like, I don't think we think about it in that way or plan it in that way. But if we did in a way, in such a way that people got a great experience, and you could do it in such a way that says, look, if I'm not around, you need to step up and perform these tasks to continue to execute. Boy, I think that would be valuable. I think that'd be incredibly valuable for teams in this way. And again, I don't think there's enough of that.
Right. I think so. I think there's a few aspects of that are really important. Number one, if the organization can't function without you, then you're never going to be allowed to take lunch or go on a vacation. And that leads to burnout across the board. And I'm sure that applies as much to corporate America as it does to the military. But the second piece of this that I think is also really important is the military is set up to develop folks into leaders and then grow their leadership skill sets over the course of a career. And so nobody expects to become a platoon leader as they first become an officer and then stay at that level for the duration of their career. Everyone at all levels of leadership expect to train that individual to be able to grow into positions of increased responsibility where they have more, leadership responsibility, and to continue to grow. And, there's an understanding that at some point everyone is going to leave the organization, and you have to train the next generation of leaders to be able to step in and be effective. And I think that's important as you look at the long-term health of not just the military, but most organizations.
So I love it. I'm going to ask you to go back a little bit in your career, if you could. When you came out of West Point, obviously West Point, our U.S. military college, and you come out an officer, but talk to me through, if you can remember back, what were some of the early leadership philosophies or techniques, learnings that you kind of were taught? Because I love the fact that you said, look, you're going to progress. We expect you to progress. It's something that as a leader you should do. And I think that's also a really interesting mindset. But what were some of the early things that set you up for that growth that were effective?
Sure. Okay. So, one of the things that the military academy specifically trains you to do is to understand, leadership really at the platoon level. And what a platoon is, for those that don't know, it's anywhere from about 20 to 40 different soldiers. And in some organizations, that's mixed gender. Some organizations, it's still, or at least from when I was coming through, it was still, men only in the infantry. That's since changed. But you spent a lot of time getting ready for that first level of leadership at the platoon level. And some of the things that you did was, understanding what the roles of leaders were. And so there's a couple of things that came up time and again throughout West Point. And one of them is as you look at each situation that you're put in, you can look at how leaders behaved in that situation, and you can either choose to emulate that in the future or choose to not emulate that based on, how you want your leadership style to grow. And so,
can I ask you a question there, Chris?
Sure.
So that's an encouraged tactic in the Army, was to say, we want you to learn from the previous leaders, either emulate or change. And that's
so you can learn what to do or what not to do in every situation of leadership. And it's up to you to figure out how you're gonna tailor your specific leadership style based on the experiences of others that you've seen go before you.
That is so counterintuitive to what I would have thought, by the way, in that is, you're basically saying, don't be a robot, don't blindly follow bad examples, learn from those examples and change, actually evolve.
Absolutely. The key to success is thinking. You have to think and sort of assess at every situation, and then determine for yourself whether that's something you want to emulate or not. And so you look at, there's a lot of emphasis in the last few years on, toxic leadership, right? Is toxic leadership something that you want to, obviously with the name, it's not something you want to do, but I'm sure most folks have experienced it in one form or another. You can learn leadership from a toxic leader, but probably it's going to be what not to do rather than what to do. And every leadership is really intertwined with how you treat people, especially the folks that work for you. And you can learn based on your own experience as to how you were treated, whether or not you want to continue to do that type of behavior. I think that's really important. But the key in all that is to be able to think about it and assess it for yourself. And that's something that West Point spent a lot of time focusing on, is how to grow your own leadership style.
That again, counterintuitive to what I would have assumed, and amazing. I think that if that is a core philosophy that says, look, we want you to think for yourself, learn from your prior experiences and improve, it's so simple. It's such a simple concept, and it's, that's incredible. That's incredible. So adapt, learn, continue, evolve, and that's something that you were taught to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. The cool. Second aspect of it, or the second thing that I would bring up is, specific to leadership, but also, sort of organizational training, is this concept of shared suffering, right? And so that's that in the military. When you look at things like Ranger School and where you're put into these situations where you haven't been able to get much sleep, or you haven't been able to get much food, you're able to, as an organization, come together in these super stressful situations and grow from that. But also you really get to see how your leadership style changes when these external pressures start to be put on you. And for Ranger School specifically, it's just a case of lack of sleep and lack of food. That can be, not necessarily exported, wholesale to corporate America, obviously. But
we might have trouble with that.
Yeah, that aspect, right? I get. But the concept of bringing organizations together to accomplish tough tasks, whether it's, you've got till midnight to turn a proposal in on a large bid for a contract, and you need the team to come together, and everybody's got to pull their own weight in that situation. You'll see which leaders will rise to the occasion in that situation. And you'll also see the team building aspect of that coming together and pulling it off, either for good or bad, with the ultimate end state. And you can learn from that. And I think that's really important to understand, that you can learn from those situations, whether the outcome was positive or negative.
How important is it after a situation like that? Because we do find ourselves there. You have to finish a project. You have to have a large deployment go live. It's stressful. There's long hours. How important is it after situations like that to assess, to say, how did we do? What could we have done better? Do you think that that's...
Absolutely. And so, for the Army, every single training event that you do has an after action review, or AAR is kind of the colloquial term, the acronym. And in that, you go through in very fine detail as to what happened, why it happened, what in some cases should have happened, and what can you do better. And even abbreviated after action reviews focus on, okay, what are 3 things that we want to sustain, and what are 3 things that we want to improve? And they'll bring in every single soldier in the organization and get their specific feedback on their thoughts for what happened and what went well, and what happened and what didn't go so well, to ultimately get better. And as you do training in a repetitive nature, that enables you to get better, so that the next time you go out, you can understand what your mistakes were and not repeat them.
Again, it sounds so simple, right? Learn from your mistakes, do those things. But I tell you right now that there's many times that we, in teams I work with or have worked with for many years, you get going a little too fast. And I don't think there's enough diligence in doing that, number one. And then number two, I also think that, again, human nature sometimes is you don't want to admit mistakes. You don't want to admit things that you think they could have done better. But if you instill that as a culture and you instill that as a practice, I think, boy, would that be effective. That would be such an amazing thing to implement.
Right. I like I said, that's something that's that really culturally is just what you do in the Army. When it comes to training, you won't do a training event without doing some type of after action review to ensure that you capture lessons learned and make sure that you can get better for future iterations to ultimately, be at a high level of training before you have to go, do these type of activities in a real world environment.
So if you have some shared suffering, which we do, not in the limited, well, maybe limited sleep, but usually not limited food. But if you have some shared suffering and you're going through it as a team, important, go after in the after action review, see how we did, right? Grow.
Right. I think, and be willing to, I think the real important part of after action reviews is, and where you really truly get better is when you can identify things that didn't go well that need to improve. It sounds great when everybody comes together in an after action review and says, hey, we did great. Yeah. Everything went perfectly. That's great, but you don't really get better in that situation. You only really get better when you can uncover those mistakes that were made by the leaders as well as everyone else, and bring those to the forefront so that you can learn from them and not repeat them in the future. That's really, I think, how you can grow as a leader and how you can grow your organization. And be willing to hear the negative feedback. Be willing to hear where you screwed up. I think that's, if you have a culture where a leader can hear how they could have made a better decision, that will enable them to grow and actually make a better decision the next go around.
So that, again, interesting. So you have leader. So not only does the leader instill this culture on teams of saying, we're going to diagnose and see how we did, but then also that leader has to be willing to accept the negative feedback from the leadership position.
Right. 100%.
Yeah, that's, right there is something I think that people probably don't. I look at myself in the mirror. I said, boy, have I been able to take criticism and get better? And I think sometimes probably not. So that's amazing. Again, just feedback and knowledge there that I think we could all take from that. Chris, so I remember when we were talking about the Bradley fighting vehicle program, you worked or managed a mix of some Army and some civilian. Is that right?
Right. The organization was very heavily Army civilian. I did have a handful of military officers that worked for me, but for the most part, the organization was comprised of Army civilians with a large amount of contractor support. So
when you're in that kind of a mixed group, you had got obviously Army who know this culture, know training, the importance, after action reports, growing, all the great stuff you did. When you bring in the civilian, what were you able to transfer over to folks that didn't train in the military, were never in the Army? Were you able to, what are some of the things you implemented that you saw that worked?
So number one, I think the most important part, and this is fundamental, at least in my mind, is you can't treat folks differently. You can't set up, okay, I have a military group over here and I treat them one way, and I have a civilian group over here and I treat them another way. You have to treat everyone the same and have the same level of expectations. But folks, whether they be military or civilian, are still looking for the same level of leadership and the same level of leadership competence. And you have to be willing to, as a leader, I think, accept feedback from your civilian workforce as much as you are willing to accept feedback from the military workforce. And if you treat them the same, what I've found is that they'll behave the same, and they'll feel just as much a part of the organization as anyone else. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to things like, hey, we didn't do this well, or hey, this didn't go as planned, doing those types of things will make the organization better and will make you better as a leader, so long as you're willing to accept the feedback, especially when it's negative. And so giving the civilians a voice in that way, I thought brought a lot of positive aspects to the organization, and ultimately made me as the leader a better leader.
I think that's, again, interesting because, most of the people that will watch this or in our corporate world won't have a mixed team in that sense, but every team they work with is mixed typically, and mixed by personalities, by genders, by backgrounds, by nationalities, where they're from. Like everybody's, so I think that's so true of just saying like everyone has the voice, everyone is contributing, feedback, positive and negative, and giving everyone that same level of responsibility to do those things is great. Again, something I am going to take away from this. Not that not that you do that anyways, but I think that I loved when you said you bring in every soldier after every event and get everybody's feedback, a true kind of 360-degree view of what happened. And is that really what happens? You really try to get everyone's feedback.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously if you have a brigade level event, you're not going to bring 3,000 folks into a room and say, okay, let's hear from everyone. But at each level, it's really at the platoon level, which is about 20 to 40 folks, you can definitely bring all those folks into a room for an hour or an hour and a half and say, okay, tell us here's, the general sequence of events, break the, what happened down into, phases or chunks or however it was originally scripted, and say, okay, what went well during this particular portion and what didn't go so well, and give everyone opportunity to share their thoughts. But yeah, and that absolutely happens.
So let's, we went back to the platoon level, 20 to 40, and some of the early concepts you learned coming out of West Point, which, by the way, 20 to 40 is actually a pretty good sized team.
Sure.
If you have 20 to 40 people that you're leading, that's a pretty good sized little group there that you got to take care of. As you progressed from, I guess you came out of West Point as a captain. Is that what happens?
Second lieutenant.
Sorry, second lieutenant. You work your way to captain. You get to lieutenant colonel. You make it all the way to colonel. Let's kind of bookend some of that experience. What are some of the what are some of the concepts that you've learned lately? Maybe even in the last, 2 or 4 years, or maybe from because the Bradley fighting vehicle program was quite a lot of people. But as you've progressed, talk to me about some of the last stuff that you're learning still.
Okay, sure. I think the lessons that I get reinforced over and over again there's really two of them. The first one is that it is the leader's responsibility to train the next level of leaders. And so whether, when I was the product manager for the Bradley program, I had both, military and civilian leaders working for me. And they are the next generation of product managers, both military and civilian. And so I felt like I had a responsibility to train them to grow into that next level of leadership. And you do that by, giving them responsibility and enabling them to, delegating authority, and then seeing how well they do. They do well, let them know if they could have done better. You can let them know that as well, and provide some constructive feedback for training the next generation. I think that kind of is reinforced over and over again, and how you have to, especially in a mixed organization with military and civilian, is to treat them the absolute same. The second piece that I go back to, and we talked about this earlier, is I continue to learn leadership, both situationally in terms of what to do and what not to do. And I constantly look at situations that I'm put in, but situations where I might not be the senior person in the room. And I'm constantly assessing, is that how I would have handled this situation? And how would I handle a similar situation in the future? And try to continue to grow in my own leadership style. I think that's something that evolves over the course of a lifetime. I don't think you all of a sudden become a leader and you've gotten it, over the course of an afternoon or even a year. I think it's a lifetime thing. And so I'm always trying to kind of see how my leadership stacks up in situations that I might not have been in. The other thing that I would just say, and this is sort of something that I've come across over the years, is I like to read a lot about folks and specifically biographies and not just military leaders. Of course, you read a lot about military leaders of the past, both contemporary and, World War II, World War I, and previous. But also you can learn a lot from how folks react in other industries, whether it's corporate America or, sports. You read about folks like Mike Krzyzewski, Vince Lombardi, Tony Dungy, folks that have really done well as leaders, in a lot of what they say, it transcends their particular, so Vince Lombardi's leadership isn't specific to football. You can export that anywhere.
Right.
Same thing with Mike Krzyzewski, his ability to kind of distill leading a college basketball team, over to success over multiple decades. There's something to be said there that's exportable beyond just college basketball. And that's another area where I try to look at what can I learn from folks that have done it well in other aspects of life, and how can I apply that to what I'm doing? So that's sort of the best way I can answer that question, Joe.
It's great. It's great. I love to hear that. I mean, one of the couple of things that just really stuck out at me through this, Chris, and again, thank you so much for your time, and learn what to do, learn what not to do, and give people the ability to learn on their own, to make their own decisions and assessments. And the fact that that's instilled in our military culture from a very early stage in our leaders is incredible. And I think that that's something, it's empowering. It's empowering for people. And if you can do that within your own organization, incredible. The second, shared suffering, number one, working together as a team, training together as a team. And then after the fact, learning, like being open to criticism and constructive work. But I think it's important. Number one is even more important, because giving that feedback, being open to that feedback, that's something you have to learn. And that's something that I think you've got a good leader doing that. Then you can do those after action reports successfully and in such a way that people really are engaged and learn. Those two things are great, Chris. And then finally, just that leadership development never ends. Those three things are really valuable. And I think something that everyone who listens to this will take something from. And I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your service. And thank you again. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, listen, my pleasure, Joe. It's always a pleasure to chat. And, these types of things are important to me, and I'm happy to make the time. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again. And we hope to do it again. I'm sure I'm going to get lots of questions and feedback. And so we might have to schedule a little bit more time together.
Sounds great.
All right.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much again.
Okay. All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.